In episode 10, we learned about how Belle Gunness lured many men to her farm and then murdered them for their money. If you are new here and want to learn more, go to my channel and watch from the beginning. Now let's learn what happened before the fire in 1908 and why Belle's ex-farmhand spent the rest of his life in prison. Welcome to episode 11, Ray Lamphere. Ray Lamphere was 37 years old in July of 1907 when he became employed at the Gunness farm. He was replaced by the previous farmhand, Emil Greening, who had left after Jenny Olson was no longer there. Ray was the son of William Lamphere, who was a prominent member of the community at the time. He was a school teacher, a politician, and justice of the peace who unfortunately had drunk away his money, his respectable social position, and his happy home. Ray, like his father, was very fond of the bottle as well. He was known as a skilled carpenter when sober, but when drunk, he squandered away his money on liquor, whores, and gambling. And it was reported that he lost $50 one night on a backroom saloon slot machine. That would be over $1,600 in today's money. There are a couple differing stories on how Ray came to work for Belle. One claim is that Belle had her eyes on him and approached him in June on the streets and asked him to come live at the farm and work for her. Other accounts say that Ray, being a member of the Carpenters Union, heard about work needed to be done at the Gunness farm from a fellow carpenter and met with Belle for an interview, and she hired him on the spot. However it happened, though, it is true that by July he lived and worked there and would boast to his buddies about how he and Belle were lovers. Belle was 11 years his senior and outweighed him by many pounds. It was hard for people to grasp that the skinny Ray would be in that kind of an affair with Belle. However, former hired hands would later confess that Belle had seduced them and would make sweet love to them. Throughout the fall of 1907, Ray and Belle were often seen together. They would ride to town in her wagon and stroll down the street side by side. Ray was in his glory at the farm. Apparently, Belle took good care of him, fed him, and he had a room in the house, but many nights slept in her bed. Then, in January of 1908, Andrew Helgeline finally came to Porte. As you remember, Belle worked on getting Andrew to her farm for 18 months. Ray Lamphere received a huge shock of his life on the morning of Friday, January 3rd, 1908, when Belle informed him that his room was being turned over to Andrew Helgeline. He was told he was to sleep in the barn. The next morning, Ray returned to the house and started his morning routine, building a fire in the parlor stove to warm the downstairs. Ray and Andrew struck up a conversation, but it was quickly interrupted when Belle came down and angrily motioned Ray aside. He later testified that, quote, Belle gave me the dickens and told me to leave him alone. Ray also testified that as soon as Andrew came, she had no use for him anymore. On February 3rd, 1908, it is unclear what happened between Ray and Belle, but it is clear and documented that a bitter break happened that day. It was so abrupt that Ray left behind his clothes and his carpenter tools. Less than a week later, she hired a new farmhand, Joe Maxon. He took up residence in the second-floor bedroom where all the previous farmhands stayed. In the meantime, Ray had consulted an attorney who counseled him to return to the farm and demand his belongings and his money. And if Belle refused, there would be a lawsuit against her. Lamphere did what his attorney told him, but Belle refused and wrote several letters to Sheriff Smutzer complaining that she was being harassed by her former handyman. The following month, she had Ray arrested for trespassing on her farm after she spotted him lurking around. Tried on March 13, 1908, before the Justice of the Peace, S.E. Grover, Ray Lamphere with no legal representation, pleaded guilty and was fined $1 plus costs. During this time, it was known by Andrew Hugling's family that Andrew was missing, and they had been in correspondence with Belle through letters. She gave Andrew's brother Asley some bogus stories of his whereabouts, which we all know now that she killed him shortly after his arrival. One might be wondering how Ray Lamphere did not know anything about this. Well, in his testimony in court, he was apparently sent to Michigan City one night by Belle to get a horse. The person he was meeting did not show up, so he came back. She sent him again and said, "Wait all night if you have to." Andrew was never seen again by Ray after that day. On March 28th, Belle filed an affidavit alleging that Ray was insane. According to the document, a printed questionnaire on which her responses were recorded by hand, she noticed, quote, "the first signs of insanity in Lamphere in December 1907 when he told me things that I knew were not true and unreasonable." Asked if she had, quote, "shown any extraordinary propensities of feeling or conduct," she replied with empathetic yes. "He comes to my house every night, at all times of night, and looks in the windows, commits misdemeanors." Though he had already been found guilty and fined for his harassing behavior, he continues same, generally while intoxicated. Presented with a checklist of behavioral traits that best describe Lamphere, Belle indicated that he was, quote, "silent, melancholy, restless, seclusive, dull, profane, filthy, intemperate, sleepless, and criminal." Appended to Belle's affidavit was a statement from Ray's physician, Dr. Bowell, who testified that he had, quote, "prescribed for Lamphere at different times during past 5 years. Have never treated him for any mental disturbance. I do not consider him insane." The 3-member Insanity Commission appointed to examine Lamphere and rule on Belle's allegation came to the same conclusion. Quote, "We find patient quiet, clean, and neat," they wrote. Quote, "He is slightly nervous. His memory is good for recent and remote events. Speech is intelligent and coherent. Ray Lamphere is not insane." When she failed at having him committed for insanity, she had him arrested again for trespassing in early April, and this is the month of the fire. His trial was set for April 15th. Meanwhile, Asley Helgeline, Andrew's brother, was writing to her asking proof of his brother's whereabouts. Belle could not give him any proof because of her bogus story she previously told him. So she blamed Ray Lamphere for stealing all of Andrew's letters he had written to her during his travels. She told Asley that Ray was jealous of Andrew. So now Belle is conjuring a story about Ray having something to do with Andrew's disappearance. Ray's second trial on April 15th was set to take place in nearby Stillwell, Indiana. His lawyer to represent him was Wirt Warden. Presiding was Justice Robert C. Kincaid. During his cross-examination of Belle, Wirt Warden, seeking to undercut her credibility, launched into an increasingly combative interrogation of her past. He asked, "Peter Gunness, your husband, died very suddenly, didn't he?" Instantly, the state's attorney, Ralph N. Smith, was on his feet. "Objection. He carried considerable life insurance, didn't he?" "Objection. You collected that life insurance, didn't you?" Smith, growing angrier by the moment, told the witness that she did not need to reply. "Mrs. Gunness," said Warden, "how did that sausage grinder and crock of hot brine come to drop on Mr. Gunness's head anyway?" Springing to his feet, Smith, his face flushed with indignation, protested in strong language against the practice of browbeating a witness and insulting a defenseless woman. Wirt Warden proceeded to question Belle about the sudden death of her first husband, Mad Sorensen, how he happened to die, whether he had any life insurance, and whether she got the life insurance. Smith's heated objection to each of these questions was sustained by Justice Kincaid. When Wirt Warden then pressed Belle about the suspicious circumstances of Mad's death, wasn't there some talk about taking up his body to see if he had been poisoned? Smith gave full vent to his outrage. "I object to these questions," he cried. "They have nothing to do with this case. I demand that they be stopped." Then turning to the witness stand, he said, "Mrs. Gunness, you would be justified in waylaying this man on his way home." Justice Kincaid concurred. "I think these questions have gone a little too far," he told Warden. Wirt Warden, seemingly chastened, indicated that he was ready to dismiss the witness. As Belle was getting to her feet, however, he said, "Oh, just a moment. When will your daughter Jenny Olson return, Mrs. Gunness?" This question brought a sharp response from Justice Kincaid, who rebuked Warden for wasting the court's time by asking such questions. By the time she left the stand, Belle, who had been perfectly composed at the start of Warden's interrogation, was visibly agitated. To Kincaid, there was nothing surprising about her reaction. It was that of any decent woman resenting such insinuations. Soon enough, he would arrive at a very different conclusion, that Warden's pointed questions had been deeply unsettling to Mrs. Gunness, reinforcing her fear, already aroused by Asley Helgeland's inquiries into his brother's whereabouts, that her crimes were catching up with her. Ray Lamphere was found guilty and ordered to pay a fine of $5 plus cost, a total of $19.01, which was covered by his current employer, a farmer named John Wheatbrook. But Belle wasn't done with her former farmhand and lover. Less than a week later, she had him arrested again for trespassing. He was lodged in the county jail when Belle received another anxious letter from Asley Helgeland. In Belle's reply, dated April 24th, she expressed her, quote, wonder as to where Andrew keeps himself, promising to, quote, tell you all I know. She repeated her earlier story, adding a few minor details. Quote, I cannot remember the accurate date he left Laporte, but it was either the 15th or 16th of January, she began. My little daughter took him to the streetcar station. He went by way of Michigan City, as he had a desire to see that little town about 12 miles from Laporte. He didn't stay there more than a day, and he left here at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 or 3 days afterwards, I had a letter from him from Chicago saying that he had hunted for his brother, but did not find him. If he couldn't find him, he would go to New York and find out if he had gone to Norway. If such was the case, I think he would go to Norway too. As I said before, he told me not to answer this letter until I had one from him telling where he would stop for a little while so he could get an answer. This is all I can tell, and I haven't this letter. I got the letter in the morning and read it and laid it in a china closet in the kitchen and went to milk, and when I came back, the letter was gone. That Lamphere was here, and he had probably taken it. I don't understand what keeps Andrew away so long, unless, as you say, he has gotten into some trouble and does not want any of us to know about it. I, for my part, thought it was strange I didn't hear from him, but I was pretty sure Lamphere had taken his letter, but I don't see why he hasn't written to you. Asley proposed to Belle that he would come to Laporte and initiate a search for his brother. Belle assured that she would be happy to assist him in any way as she could, though, quote, I don't know what we could do to find him. The day after Belle composed this letter, Ray Lamphere was brought once more to trial. On the witness stand, both Belle and her 11-year-old daughter Myrtle claimed that Lamphere was back to his prowling. Just a few days earlier, they had spotted him by the pig pen and hurried out to chase him away. They were within 15 feet of him when he coolly cut the wire fence and pulled out the fence post and carried it away. This time, however, Ray's defense lawyer, Warden, was able to call a pair of witnesses, 2 substantial citizens of the county, who swore that On this day, his client was allegedly vandalizing her property. Lamphere was at the home of John Wheatbrook, about 6 miles out of town, and could not possibly been at the home of Mrs. Gunness. Lamphere was acquitted, leaving Belle to foot the bill for the costs. A lady, Miss Bertha Schultz, a clerk in the Chicago Leader Dry Goods store on Main Street, who frequently waited on Mrs. Gunness, later reported that during the last week in April, Belle had come in looking very distressed. When Miss Schultz asked what was the matter, Belle recounted her troubles with Lamphere, describing the things which he did to harass her, and declaring that he acted as if he knew something about her and that he was bold and annoyed her repeatedly. The next day, she was back in the store, once again giving vent to her worries over Lamphere. She told me that he feared he would someday set fire to her home and buildings, Miss Schultz would say afterward, and that he would murder her and her children. The day before the fire, on April 27, 1908, Belle hitched up her buggy and drove into town. Her first stop was the office of her lawyer, Melvin E. Lealighter. She tearfully informed him that she was living in fear of Ray Lamphere, who was threatening to burn her house down. Lealighter advised that the simplest way to deal with Lamphere was to fill him full of buckshot the next time he showed up at her farm uninvited. Dismissing the suggestion, Belle told the lawyer that she wished to make out her last will and testament. She, quote, wanted to leave everything in good shape in case something happened. Lealighter proceeded to write out the document according to Belle's instructions. She left all of her property, both real and personal, to her 3 children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip, providing that, in the case of the death of any of said children, without issue, before her death, the survivor is to inherit the whole of the property, and provided also that in the case of the death of all 3 said children, without issue, the whole of the property should go to the Norwegian Children's Home of Chicago. Once her will was completed and signed, Belle took it to the state bank, where she placed it in a safe deposit box and made a cash deposit of $730. Her next errand was at a store where she purchased candy, cake, and a toy train, telling the clerk, Marie Farnheim, that she was going to give the children a little treat. "Is it a birthday party?" asked Miss Farnheim. "No," said Belle, "I am just going to give them a little surprise." Belle's trip to town that afternoon ended at John Minnick's general store, where, as clerk George Wass recalled, she purchased a large quantity of groceries. She bought something else too, 2 gallons of kerosene and a 5-gallon can that she borrowed from the proprietor, explaining that she had searched for her own oil can before leaving home but had been unable to find it. She had been in the store about 15 minutes when Ray Lamphere entered and asked for a 5-cent plug of chewing tobacco. According to Wass, no words passed between Lamphere and Mrs. Gunness, not even a nod of recognition. Lamphere just stood by the counter and glared at her while she finished up her shopping. He then followed her outside and watched as she untied her horse from the hitching post and drove off in her buggy. Belle arrived home about 5:30 p.m. Joe Maxon helped her with her purchases, carrying the oil can into the house and stowing it in the entry under the back stairs. An hour later, he and the family sat down to a supper of bread and butter, dried beef, salmon, beefsteak, and potatoes. Everyone showed a fine appetite. Maxon said later, "We all had a couple helpings of beefsteak and lots of cookies and jam." When the meal was done and the dishes cleared from the table, the 5 of them, Maxon, Belle, Lucy, Myrtle, and Philip, retired to the parlor and played all kinds of games, the main one being Little Red Riding Hood and the Fox. According to Maxon's recollections, Mrs. Gunness loved to play this game and almost cried if the bad fox chanced to catch Red Riding Hood. By 8:30, Maxon was having trouble staying awake. Bidding the others goodnight, he headed for the stairway. The last I saw of Mrs. Gunness, he recalled, she was sitting on the floor with her daughters and son, playing with the toy engine and passenger coaches she had bought earlier that day for the children. What happens next is what puts this whole story together in the beginning of the news of Belle Gunness to the world. Stay tuned for the next episode where we will be going through all of the court proceedings and find out how Ray Lamphere spent the rest of his short life in the Michigan City, Indiana State Prison. Thank you, and like and subscribe for more.